We are still looking at the seventh day Sabbath, the day of rest from work, and a day of worship to God. This is what we have seen so far, that God instituted a day of rest, first of all for himself, then for his people. Then he extended that day of rest to be a day of worship where his people will come together, put aside everything that they would normally do for the first 6 days of the week and come to worship him, assemble as his people to worship him on the seventh day of the week. And it is called a holy assembly in the Bible. That is what we have seen so far. Last time around, we ended with Deuteronomy chapter 5, verse 15, where it says, "You shall remember that you were slaves in the land of Egypt, and the Lord your God brought you out of there by a mighty hand and by an outstretched arm. Therefore, the Lord your God commanded you to observe the Sabbath day." And we concluded with that statement, indicating that God tied the observance of the Sabbath day with the deliverance of the Israelites from slavery in Egypt. And in that connection, the observance of the seventh day will not really apply to us, seeing that we were not delivered by God. If it is being tied to the deliverance of God's people from Egypt, and some people might be saying, okay, we are supposed to be observing the Sabbath day, we cannot use this as a basis to say that we should do that or we must do that because of what is said here in this verse before us. God is tying it to their deliverance. If we were not part of their deliverance, the Sabbath day, as to what we have seen so far, it may not apply to anybody who had not been delivered by God at that time from slavery in Egypt. So we need to move on. And one of the things that I said last time around also is that as far as I have seen and what we have looked at, there isn't really anything that we can use to make applications to ourselves as yet in all that we have seen so far, because everything is focused primarily on God, number one, and on the nation Israel. Number two, all that God has been doing and saying, nothing was addressed to the rest of the world as such. Another thing that we need to remember is that God, in organizing the religious observances for his people, he organized it for Israel. And that is not to say that the rest of the world were not engaged in religious activities. They were. And one of the warnings that God gave to Israel upon entering the promised land, he said to them, do not do the things that are being done in Egypt, and do not do the things that are being done by the people who are being dispossessed of the land that you are now going to possess, and so on. So that tells us that these people were engaged in religious activities, and God is setting something peculiar, something different for the children, the nation of Israel, the sons of Israel. And we need to bear that in mind as we go along. All right, so if you have no questions coming out of that review, let's move on and see what we will discover this evening. So as I said before, it is the seventh day Sabbath that we are dealing with, remembering also that we saw in our previous studies that there were other Sabbaths established by God. Some of them were not on the seventh day of the week and so on. But our focus, our concern is with the seventh day Sabbath, because that is where the contention is, where the uncertainty is with those who asked that we have a study on the 7-day Sabbath to determine whether or not we are worshiping on the right day, seeing that we do not worship on the seventh day, but on the first day of the week, as far as we know it to be the first day of the week. All right, so let's see where we go from there. What kind of attitude does God require from his people regarding the Sabbath day? I believe one of the things that will give us, or should have given us, a clue as to the attitude people should have is what God said the punishment must be for those who broke the Sabbath in those days. God said the punishment was death, and he demonstrated that he was serious about that when a person was found picking up sticks on the Sabbath day, and God said to Moses and to Aaron, what I said stands, this man must die because he did not treat the day as a holy day as I commanded. But we can look further to see what God required of the nation Israel as far as the attitude towards this day was concerned. And we have an idea of that given to us in Isaiah chapter 58, verse 13, where it says, if because of the Sabbath, and this is God speaking to his people, Israel, through the prophet Isaiah, and what we are reading is many, many years after what took place in the wilderness and what took place when they were entering the promised land and so on. This is many years after that. All right, so it says in verse 13, if because of the Sabbath, you turn your foot from doing your own pleasure on my holy day and call the Sabbath a delight, the holy day of the Lord, honorable, and honor it, desisting from your own ways, from seeking your own pleasure and speaking your own words, then you will take delight in the Lord, and I will make you ride on the heights of the earth, and I will feed you with the heritage of Jacob, your father, for the mouth of the Lord has spoken. And this gives us an idea as to what God was looking for as far as the attitude of the people was concerned in observing the Sabbath. The observance of the Sabbath should not have been something casual. It should not have been something that they just did out of rote. It should not be they just doing it because they had no choice or anything like that. Look at what God is saying to them. At this time, they were actually being warned by God because of their many years of disobedience and rebellion. And they were not observing the Sabbath in the way that they were supposed to be observing it. He says, if because of the Sabbath, you turn your foot from doing your own pleasure on my holy day. Number one. So in God's mind, God's intent was that his people do not do their own business on his day. The day was set aside for God's business and God's business alone. So all other activities must be put aside. All other activities by these people, they had to cease doing all the other things that they were doing. This is what should have been happening when they assembled. Observe the Sabbath in a way that is pleasing to God because God recognized it as a holy day. Remember or bear in mind that the Sabbath was not a holy hour. It was not a holy 3 hours. It was a holy day. So the whole day had to be dedicated to God. We can say from our standpoint, we can say from 6 to 6, the whole day had to be dedicated to God. And we need to bear that in mind as far as what God required of the people back then. Continuing to read, and call the Sabbath a delight. So once again, it was supposed to be a delight for the people. It was supposed to be something that they enjoyed doing. They were not supposed to be doing it regretting that they had to do it, because what they really wanted to do was something else. It had to be a delight for it to be pleasing to God, a delight to the people. The holy day of the Lord, honorable. So they had to recognize it as something honorable that they were doing to God in God's presence. And they had to honor him in doing that. So he's saying, as we continue to read, that they were to desist from their own ways, seeking their own pleasures. So even if they didn't go to work and they went about seeking their own pleasures, doing their own thing, having fun, whatever it is, and God wasn't the focus of it, God wasn't the center of it, it was still wrong. The attitude would still have been wrong. And God promised that if they observe the Sabbath, if they had this right mindset, this right attitude, and observe the Sabbath in the right way, that he was going to bless them. This is what verse 14 says. Then you will take delight in the Lord, and I will make you ride on the heights of the earth, and I will feed you with the heritage of Jacob, your father, for the mouth of the Lord has spoken. So God was committing himself to do that. It is as if he was taking an oath that once they observe the Sabbath in the way that they were supposed to, that numerous blessings will come upon them. Having seen all of that, the question should come up in our minds, okay, so could any of this thing be applied to me in my time, in my efforts to worship God? Could any of this that we have seen be applied to me? And one of the things that we need to know that will help us to answer that question is that God, in dealing with Israel, the sons of Israel, the nation Israel, whichever term you're comfortable with, in dealing with Israel, God gave them laws, he gave them instructions, and we saw a bit of that in what we have looked at before, in that God gave them the 10 Commandments, his laws for them. God gave them religious laws that they were supposed to exercise, to practice in observing the Sabbath day and things like that. So we need to have a sort of hold on the laws. We need to have an understanding of the laws that God gave to them, why he gave those laws to them, and see if any of those laws could be applicable to us now. And if so, then we may be able to make some connections as to whether or not this Sabbath day of rest or of worship could be applied to us. We need to understand the laws that he gave, remembering that included in the 10 Commandments is the Sabbath, the seventh-day Sabbath. So let's have a look at the laws that God gave to the nation Israel, and that again will help us set the foundation or make the determination as to whether or not we are supposed to be observing a seventh-day Sabbath as Israel observed the seventh-day Sabbath. So God gave laws to Israel. Remember that God was dealing with Israel all the time. That is not to say that he wasn't dealing with the rest of the world, but what we have recorded for us in the scripture is God's dealings with Israel. And that is what we are using as our guide, as our instruction, as our foundation, springboard to move from what he did to them to know what we are supposed to do in obedience to him. So we are following that. This is what the Bible has presented to us. God's laws. There are 3 categories of laws that God gave to Israel. The first one is the 10 Commandments, and that is normally referred to as the moral law. I deliberately didn't put the moral law there first as the category, whereas that should be the category. But most of us might be a little confused as to what is meant by a moral law. So I'm just saying the 10 Commandments, and that is the first one. The second one is that God gave laws. The second category is that God gave laws to govern their religious ceremonies, and we saw a bit of that when we looked at Leviticus, and we talked about the various feasts and so on, what was supposed to happen in Leviticus chapter 23. That gave us an idea as to the laws laid down by God for the religious activities. The whole of Leviticus, that is what it is about. God giving religious laws to govern what the people do in their times of worship in his presence. And the third category is that God gave civil laws. What do we mean by civil laws? These were the laws that the government, we may say, was supposed to use to govern the people according to God's standards. So these are the 3 categories of laws that were given. If we ask ourselves, okay, so do these laws, these categories that God gave in the Old Testament, do they apply to us now? If we ask that question, that will be a good, a legitimate question. And once again, we will make an attempt to answer that. And I'm doing that because I believe all of this will help us to understand whether or not we are supposed to be worshiping right now, today, in our time, worshiping God on the seventh day or any other day. So let's talk about the Ten Commandments. The Ten Commandments summarizes God's universal, unchanging law for all people, for all times. This is what the Ten Commandments is. And when we talk about the moral law, that is what it is. It is a moral standard that God has set, not just for the sons of Israel, but for the whole world, for all times. This is a summary. What we have in the Ten Commandments is not everything spelled out. It is like God giving the headings of the various laws in the Ten Commandments. And the purpose for the Ten Commandments then was to proclaim God. Oftentimes when we think of the Ten Commandments, we think about laws. Okay, these are the things that we are supposed to do and not supposed to do, and the focus is on us. But the focus in the Ten Commandments is really not on us, it is on God. It is on God saying, this is who I am. It is proclaiming God. It is talking about his character. It is saying to us that God is holy. And because this is who God is, this is how we are supposed to behave in his presence. The focus really is not so much on what we are to do or not to do, but the focus is on God, proclaiming or presenting God to human beings as to who he really is. And having seen that, this is how we are supposed to relate to him. That is summarized for us in the Ten Commandments. So if it is God's universal law for all people, for all times, it means that God did not give the Ten Commandments to the sons of Israel only for the sons of Israel, but for everybody. So he could have been using, or we could look at it this way, God was using Israel as the showpiece to present to us who God is. If we go back to Exodus, you'll remember that before the nation Israel was delivered from Egypt, when God was speaking to Moses, one of the things that Moses said to God was, when I go to these people and say, God said this, you might ask me, who is this God? What is his name? And the second thing we need to remember in that connection is that Pharaoh, when Moses went to him and said, our God said to let us go so that we could worship, Pharaoh said, who is that God? I don't know him. As far as I know, I am the God. And God proceeded after that to show both to the nation Israel, the people that he was delivering, and the nation Egypt, the people that he was delivering them from, to show both of them who he is. And that is what the plagues and the Red Sea and all of that was about, to show to the people who he is. And so when we get to Exodus chapter 20, and God is now giving the Ten Commandments, that is what he's continuing to do, to present himself, to proclaim himself. The Ten Commandments is to proclaim God as to who he is. Questions or comments? So that proclamation then is to the whole world, to Egypt, representing the rest of the world, and to Israel, representing Israel. So let's just look at the first section of the Ten Commandments, and you will see what God said there. The way he begins in giving the Ten Commandments tells us that this is what it is about. Verse 1 of Exodus chapter 2, it says, then God spoke all these words, saying, I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. You shall have no other gods before me. So God is setting himself aside, setting himself above anything and anyone that may present themselves as a God. He says, you shall have no other gods before me. Verse 4, you shall not make for yourself an idol or any likeness of what is in heaven above or on the earth beneath or in the waters under the earth. He's setting himself aside, apart. You shall not worship them or serve them, for I, the Lord, your God, am a jealous God, visiting the iniquity of the fathers on the children, on the third and fourth generations of those who hate me, but showing loving kindness to thousands, to those who love me and keep my commandments. And this is how he began, giving the 10 commandments. And this tells us, this sets the tone for what comes after that, that God is separate, God is holy, God is all by himself. He is unique, and he is the one to worship, no one else. Questions or comments? So let's go now. If you have nothing on the 10 commandments and the moral law, we could go now to the next category of laws that God gave to the nation Israel. The purpose of the ceremonial laws was to present God as the only deliverer. Remember, the ceremonial laws had to do with the things that they did as religious activities in worshiping God. When they assembled together or when they brought their offerings or whatever it is God gave them to do as religious activities, these were ceremonial laws. They were the ceremonies that they were supposed to engage in their times of worship. Either when they came as individuals to make offerings to God, or when they assembled as God's people to worship him, these activities, they were given to them by God, and they were the ceremonies that they were supposed to practice. Therefore, they are called ceremonial laws. The purpose of the ceremonial laws was to present God as the only deliverer. The nucleus of that is that God was providing the means of salvation, and this is what he was picturing in giving them all these ceremonial laws, that he was the one to provide salvation. God provided the means of salvation to them, to the nation Israel. So his first picture of that was delivering them from slavery in Egypt. But coming now into the wilderness, and when they will be entering the promised land, they were to be reminded all the time, not only of their physical deliverance from slavery in Egypt, but also of their spiritual deliverance. Because all the offerings and sacrifices and things that they were making all had to do with sin. And this is, as I said before, this is what is given to us in Leviticus. So God, in giving them these ceremonies, he was saying to them, I am more than your deliverer from Egypt. I am also your deliverer from sin. I am the one that's providing the means of salvation from sin for you. And that is what the ceremonial laws were all about. Questions or comments?
Yes, I have a couple questions.
Okay.
You said to us that we should forget all that we think about the Sabbath and so come with open minds to the study.
Right.
So you gave a deduction tonight that the 10 commandments are universal for all people through all ages, for
Right.
all time.
Right.
But that's a deduction, but we haven't got any proof of that from the scripture. So that's a deduction that you came to, that
Okay.
you're asking us to accept, that we don't have any evidence of as to why we should accept it.
Okay.
And then the other thing, because we know that we don't continue with the ceremonial laws, you have to provide us with the evidence as to why the 10 commandments remain binding to people of all times through all the ages, but the ceremonial laws are not. It's basically the answer to the same question, right?
Yes, yeah, I got you. I'm not supposed to answer that right now, right?
No, I expect that it will require research to tell us why we have to
tell you why.
believe that it's universal through all time.
Okay, good. Right. Appreciate that. All right, so the answer will definitely come. Okay, so we are saying then that the purpose of the ceremonial law, or the purpose of the ceremonial laws, was to present God as the only deliverer, and God provided the means of salvation for his people in giving them all these ceremonial laws, or showing them that he was the one who was providing the means of salvation by giving them all these ceremonial laws. We have an example of that in the Day of Atonement, and we looked a little bit about on that before, and we're going to look at another section of what is said on the Day of Atonement to the nation Israel. The Day of Atonement pictured God's ultimate deliverance of his people from sin. When we look at Leviticus chapter 16, verse 7, for example, it says there that he, referring to Aaron the priest, he shall take the two goats, and I'm trusting that you know something of what went before, verse 7, the two goats, and present them before the Lord at the doorway of the tent of meeting. Aaron shall cast lots for the two goats, one lot for the Lord, and the other lot for the scapegoat. Then Aaron shall offer the goat on which the lot for the Lord fell, and make it a sin offering. So a sin offering is being offered to God on behalf of his people, the nation Israel, and the sin offering is one of two goats that were presented or brought before the Lord. The second goat, as we saw in verse 8, is called a scapegoat, and I believe we all should have an idea of what a scapegoat means. Verse 10 says, but the goat on which the lot for the scapegoat fell shall be presented alive before the Lord to make atonement upon it, to send it into the wilderness as the scapegoat. So two things are being done there. Number one, an offering is being made to God as payment for the sins. And the second thing that is being done there is that the second goat, the scapegoat, is taking upon itself the guilt of the people. And instead of the people being punished for their sins, the scapegoat is the one that is punished, number one, by it being carried out into the wilderness, never to come back into the presence of the people. And so the sins of the people that have been taken away, the scapegoat representing that those sins being taken away and never coming back into the presence of God. And in this, we are seeing God presenting himself as the provider of salvation for his people. So that is the second category of laws given. The question again that we could ask ourselves in that connection is, could this be applied to us? What was taking place there on the Day of Atonement? Could this be applied to us, or is it only relevant to Israel, ancient Israel at that time, or maybe even contemporary Israel? And the third area or category of laws that God gave to the nation Israel was civil laws. And the civil laws were given so that law and order would be maintained in the nation Israel. We know that once there is not a universal set of laws for everybody in a nation, it means that everybody will be free to do what they want, and nobody could hold them accountable because there are no laws. But once there is a standard set of laws for everybody, everybody is supposed to live by, comply with those laws. And that is what will maintain law and order among people. So this is what God provided for Israel when he gave them civil laws. So that when they would have entered into their land and be established as a nation, they would have their standard of laws given to them by God by which to live. And anyone violating those laws would have to pay the consequences. An example of civil laws given in the Old Testament. Leviticus chapter 24, verse 17. If a man takes the life of any human being, he shall surely be put to death. The one who takes the life of an animal shall make it good, life for life. In other words, you suppose if you take the life of somebody's animal, you're supposed to give them one in return. If a man injures his neighbor just as he has done, so it shall be done to him. So exactly what he did to your neighbor, that is what is supposed to be done to you. If you cuff him on his nose, you're supposed to get a cuff back on your nose. Verse 20, fracture for fracture. So if you fracture his right leg, you're supposed to get your right leg fractured. Eye for eye, tooth for tooth. Just as he has injured a man, so it shall be inflicted on him. And that is an example of civil laws, a set of civil laws given by God to the nation Israel. Verse 21, thus the one who kills an animal shall make it good, but the one who kills a man shall be put to death. There shall be one standard for you. It shall be for the stranger as well as for the native, for I am the Lord your God. And this is an example of God giving to the nation Israel civil laws by which to govern the whole nation in their civil or in their normal daily activities and interactions with each other.
Was this what Claude was hinting at last week?
No, I don't think so, no.
Different.
Yes, I think it's different. He was talking about his attitude, what his attitude is supposed to be in carrying out what God said. I don't think that he had this in mind. Any question, anything else from anybody?
I just want to comment that, not ask a question, just comment that the more we look at the laws given by God, we can see the connection between our laws in the country and God's laws.
Okay.
And to say it differently, most of the laws that apply to countries, even some countries that don't believe in God, they are based on the same biblical pattern. A lot of them are, not every single one, but a lot of them are. So I've often wondered whether they really use the scriptures, all of those people, whoever, whether they really use the scriptures in setting their law. Now, I know as far as England way back when is concerned, a lot of their laws were set on the Bible. There's civil laws that you're talking about. So you'll see a sort of connection between their civil laws and the laws that are stated in the scriptures. Just a comment.
Okay, thank you.
That is true, Ruth, but I believe that that has its root in Romans 1 and 2, when God says he has written his laws on the heart of man. So I feel that all cultures and all societies have the same biblical law, so to speak, quote unquote, biblical, written as an expression of God determining the conscience of man that he created.
Okay. Yes, that makes a lot of sense. And to continue, even when they probably don't even really believe in God per se in the same way, because God, I guess because God has put it on their hearts, they are maybe forced, that's a very strong word, to believe and to apply those rules and laws and regulations to their normal daily lives. So yeah, that is, I would agree with that.
Okay, so the final thing I want to do this evening is, well, I should ask a question. Do you see any link or connection between what you know the 10 Commandments talk about and what we have just looked at in the civil law?
The only thing I could see is the reasoning behind it. For I am the Lord your God. I don't know if that's what you mean. I don't know that I understand the question properly either.
I agree. I'm not sure that I understand the question completely yet myself.
How I see it relates is that part of the Ten Commandments deals with relationship, men to men. Civil law, to an extent, deals with the same relationship.
Okay.
As to, if you kill, how you deal with people.
Okay.
That's what I say.
Okay. The reason, well, I don't know how else to phrase my question, but the reason why I ask it is because if we look this that I give you is just a sampling of the civil laws that God gave to Israel. But if we look at the civil laws in general, we will see that all the civil laws, they actually come out of the moral laws. They are based on what the moral laws say. So that if we say that the civil laws were to govern Israel as a nation, when God would have established them as a nation, God didn't go contrary or give something new or in addition to what he had already given in the Ten Commandments to establish the civil laws. And in the civil laws, we will have more details. Obviously, as you have read here, we see more details regarding killing. And what we have in the moral law regarding killing is all it says that thou shalt not kill. And that will be the heading. But here it gives us some more details regarding killing. And it has not only to do with killing another human being, but also killing or depriving another person of their property, and in particular of one kind of animal or another. So from that standpoint, we could understand why the Ten Commandments must be viewed as a summary of the laws of what God intends for people to do. And in given the civil laws, God is more or less given an expansion of the same moral laws that he gave in the Ten Commandments to govern the nation Israel as a nation. That is where I think we could reach in our study this evening, remembering that we are still looking at the fact that God was dealing with Israel. And although, as Kathleen mentioned, that I say that the Ten Commandments is supposed to be universal because it is a moral law, we have to still look at it for the time being as God dealing with Israel as a nation. And I don't think the time has come yet for us to make the transition, if there is one to be made, and to say, okay, this set doesn't deal with only Israel, this set deals with us, the rest of us. And maybe, as Gaten pointed out, I might have been a bit premature in saying what I said concerning the Ten Commandments, but we will get there. Let's pray, please. Dear God and Father, we thank you for your goodness to us, for your word, for what you have presented to us. And as our song this evening started off, teach us your way. Teach us to know what is right and what is wrong, so that we will do the right things in serving you. We ask through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen.